Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're just going to be digging down on an aspect of melody writing which I'm hoping is going to be useful to composers. So what you see on the screen is simply 3 bars, 3 measures of a melody written by Mozart. In fact, it's the very first melodic phrase that we find in the overture of his opera Cosi tutti. It goes like this. Okay, now the thing I want to talk about is the fact that this short melody contains 3 basic components. And I want to talk about why that makes it a really strong melodic statement, even though it's so brief, and why it gives Mozart opportunity for development later on. The point of doing this is that I think many composers get slightly frustrated with their melodic writing because they often write a melody that maybe is presented in one dimension. Of course, there's a danger that if you throw lots of different ingredients at the same melody, it's confusing to the listener because is the melody this? Is it that? What's going on here? But have a look at how Mozart goes about this. So I'm going to suggest to you that the first component in this melody is this opening statement. So we've got these 4 notes. Okay, what's going on there? Well, we're in the key of C major, and these notes simply spell out the tonic chord of C major. C, E, G. Now he starts on the dominant G, and he travels up the chord to C, to E, and finishes on G, an octave above the first G. So that is a very distinctive component. It's disjunct. In other words, none of those notes are next door to each other. We're leaping from one note to the next. So that's a very strong opening feature of this melodic statement, that we're just going up this chord. We're going from the 5th of the chord to the 5th of the chord, not from the tonic. I mean, he could have started on C and gone up a chord. That's perfectly reasonable. He could have started on E and gone up the chord. That's perfectly reasonable. He's decided to start on G and go up the chord because the G is not finished, is it? It's kind of leading us on somewhere else. So I think the fact that he's gone to the dominant note, to the 5th note of the scale at the end of the first component, is Mozart's way of saying this is going to push us on to the second component. If he'd started on C and gone up to C, well, it sounds like it's finished already, doesn't it? So all done, we can go home. It's a pretty short melody. It's kind of not really grabbed our attention, has it? And it's one component that we've heard. So by going up to G, he's leading us to expect that, well, the show's not over. We're going on to something else. So interesting features of that first melodic component. At the same time, it's spelling out the tonic chord of C major, helping us right at the beginning of this overture, right at the beginning of this opera, to say, we're in the key of C major. So it has a harmonic function as well as a melodic function. Notice the rhythm isn't kind of overexciting, just going from a minim to a minim there, or a half note to a half note, and then just using 2 crotchets or 2 quarter notes in between. But the 2 notes I've circled give you a very distinct beginning and end of that first component. Okay, what's the second component? Well, it seems to me that we've got this thing here. Now, it's worth thinking, that second component, how is it different from the first component? One thing you notice is it's busier. The rhythm is going much faster. Now we're dealing with semiquavers or with 16th notes, aren't we? The second thing you'll notice about it is that the second component is all conjunct movement, all notes next door to each other. So the first component was entirely disjunct, the second component is entirely conjunct. There's also a sense of balance between the first component and the second component. The first component was kind of taking us up into the sky. The second component starts one note higher, so it's kind of leading us on, and then it comes down. So we've got a rise in the first component, a fall in the second component. We've got this disjunct first component, conjunct second component. We've got this kind of fairly stately rhythm climbing up in the first component, a very busy rhythm flying down in the second component. So you see how he's achieving contrast and presenting us with two different components. Okay, well, what about the third component? Well, it's a question of whether you see the third component as this or as this. Either is perfectly reasonable. In other words, that this note could be both the last note of component 2 and could be the first note of component 3. Or you might say, no, that's the last note of component 2, so I see component 3 as this. So component 3 is either or it's... I'm inclined myself to see it as the latter because it kind of feels more like a statement in its own right. Okay, now what's going on here that's making this different from the first two components? Well, we've got this very distinctive dotted rhythm, haven't we? Bum, ba, bum, that we haven't had before. So it's interesting that each of the three components has its own rhythmic identity. We've got slight disjunct movement in that we're leaping up a third there. It's the smallest amount of disjunct movement possible. Then we're conjunct, and then we have a repeated note. First time we've had a repeated note in the third component. And this rhythm is kind of helping us to declaim the end of the phrase. We're coming to a cadence. And especially with a repeated note, that D is kind of implying a chord 5. So it's not the end of anything. It's kind of implying an imperfect cadence, isn't it? 1, 5. So that's kind of saying we've come to the end of the phrase, but by no means have we come to the end of the piece or anything. We're now waiting for what's going to come next to balance this phrase, particularly it being a classical period piece where often you have antecedent and consequent phrases, the second phrase balancing the first. Actually, in this piece, Mozart kind of separates it out a bit further. He has a kind of orchestral chord first, then he has this bit of melody writing, then we have another bit of orchestral chord, and then another bit of melody writing. But the next bit of melody writing belongs to this. However, whatever style you're writing in, what I'm proposing here is that we have something to learn from Mozart, because within that first phrase, you've got these three components, and it's worth thinking, what are the distinctive features of each component? How does one component balance with another? And at the same time, how do we end up with a melody that kind of works and doesn't just sound like we've rammed three completely different things into the same space and now we're left feeling a little bit confused orally by what's going on? But actually, there's something, isn't there, about the rise and the fall and then the stability of that that makes the shape of that phrase work quite nicely. And there's something about the rhythmic independence and this question of conjunct and disjunct that gives us variety within the melody. There's something about the boldness of this rising arpeggio, followed by the very quick activity of this, followed by the distinctive rhythm and repeated note that declaims the cadence, that enables those three components to do their jobs as the first thing that's happening in the phrase, as the middle of the phrase, and at the end of the phrase, how it closes. So I'm not thinking about harmony at all here. I'm not thinking about anything else that's going on in this piece. I'm just thinking about taking a snapshot of this unusual length melody, 3 bars, 3 measures, and just saying it's a great example of a melodic line that has these 3 components and how we use those to balance each other to generate a short phrase that says a lot in a very small space. So there we have it, just a kind of insight into 3 bars, 3 measures of Mozart, from which we can learn a huge amount about one way of constructing a melodic line. Well, if you found this video helpful, let me invite you to take a tour of the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. We've got all sorts of things on there for composers. So if you are a composer thinking about the kind of things we've been exploring during this video, we've got a composition course that's just there, kind of really explaining the components of composition, how to set about writing melodies, dealing with rhythm, dealing with chords, structuring things, how to organize your texture and so on. So if you're looking for a kind of real baseline composition course, then it's there. We've got more specialist things as well. So if you're someone who's saying, yeah, okay, this is all great, all this kind of traditional tonal kind of writing, but I want to do something else. I want to experiment with dissonance. I want to find my own voice. Then you might well be interested in our 12-tone composition course. So what we call serialism, which may be something that appeals to you. It may be that you want to understand how serialism works when we've kind of assigned equal rights to all 12 semitones or half steps of the scale. And then there's a system that composers like Schoenberg used. Or you may think, oh no, I don't want to do all that. It just sounds like maths to me. However, number of people who've done that course have told us, I don't want to be a serial composer writing this 12-tone stuff, but it's really taught me a huge amount about how to deal with dissonance, how to balance dissonance and consonance, and it's kind of taken me into a new space as a composer. So there's a great deal to learn from that. We've got lots of other resources out there as well. So if you're feeling frustrated as a composer that you've got ideas, you can't write them down, there's an oral dictation course. If you're thinking, actually, my theory knowledge is a bit weak, well, there's a course for you in theory. So lots of things out there. Have a look at the website, see what there is that's going to help empower you to the next level of being a musician, being a composer. www.mmcourses.co.uk